But what happens now if we wanted to run this function twice, right? We would need var num2, right, equals, 1500 might do it. We'd have to play with that based on how we've set up our function. We need var x2, y2, etc., right? And, oops, that was interesting, right? So let's just take a pause there, because we can do that, right? And, managing two sets of variables like this wouldn't be too crazy of a thing to do. But then what if we want 3? What about 4? What about 10, right? All of a sudden, if we had 10 of these that we wanted to draw to the screen, all of a sudden our variables become quite unmanageable, right? So, right, we're incrementing, right? Oh, that should be 2. We're incrementing by 2. We're we're trying to keep the same naming strategy and so on, right? But this is where objects become extremely handy, right? So, right, objects and arrays. But let's start with objects, and when we get into animation, we'll look at putting them together, right? So if we just take a step back, right, and let's look at our function here, where we've got all these and num1, x1, where really we don't need the ones there, right? We could just remove them all and have this. So we should probably clean that up. But before we do that, let's create a variable where we are going to have object1, right? So we're going to create an object that is going to hold all this data, right? So let's just insert this into our object, right? So now we can say, okay, well, we need the number of loops, right? And let's set it to 1500 just because that's where we are. Sorry, it's a comma, right? We need an x. We don't need to do x1, x2, x. We can just, because we can augment this variable name, we don't need to augment everything else, right? So x will be 0, y will start at 0, right? Then change in x1, I guess change in x1, we can keep that as it is, 10, right? I prefer a name that was shorter than that, but maybe we'll do that next time. Change in y1. Also, we can have those names whatever we want that helps us remember. Right, our radius, what did we have that at? 10. Right, our color, which we have at, 260, which is purple, right? You could choose another color. Our alpha, which is 0.5, right? And then our random value, which we use in the function, which we have at 0.1, right? So now, instead of having this sort of long list of what will become unmanageable variables, we can now have, right, more manageable objects which share the same property names, right? Okay, so let's get rid of this, right? So we're going to re-evaluate our function in a very different way. So we're going to get rid of that, and we are going to, right, so now when we call this, right, let's get rid of all that. Let's call it, let's leave this how we have it, right? We don't need to update this, even though these ones are redundant, because we're not doing num2 or num3. within our function, right? Here we can now say, okay, well, let's do object1.num, object1.x, object1.y, object1.c, object1.r, object1.a, object1.change in x1, object1.change in y1, and object1.rand, right? Okay. So let's just zoom out a little bit there so we can see that. Now, granted that is tedious, right, having that many object names, but let's just take a look, right? It still works. So perfect. We have set this up where we are now able to we're now able to use this function and pass it an object calling the properties associated with the variables that we need for our function, right? And we'll get to a way of cleaning that up next time. But for right now, let's just deal with this, right? So now let's copy this, right? And, you know, yes, we wrote this, so copying this isn't a problem. Let's create another one. And let's change this a bit. So perhaps let's change the color, let's change the alpha, and let's change the random, right? Then I'm going to copy this function call and this change it to 2, right? And there are ways of doing this, right? We keep sort of abstracting out and making things easier or more efficient, right? So now, let's see what happens, right? So now we have 2, right? We have two of them, right? Now, what we think of that or whatnot, that's fine. Maybe we'd want to, you know, change that color a little bit. That works a little more. You know, maybe we'd want to totally change this around where the increment, right, the increment is greater in y, maybe a little more, right? Maybe we make the radius bigger. Ooh, that's too big, right? So the point is, I don't want to get caught playing around with that. Of course, we could get rid of this one, right? So we just see, right, yellow isn't working for me, so let's do 100. What was 100? Green. Okay. Right. Right, that really worked well with that. Right, so maybe we make the radius even smaller. What if we did 5? Right, okay, right. And now what if we add them back together? Right, okay. You know, perhaps we raise this back up, raising the alpha. Okay, interesting. There we go. Let's leave it at that. Something a little more interesting than what we were getting, right? Now that I'm doing that, I want to raise the random just to see. There we, let's do 1.5, right? Let's leave it there. I get caught wanting to play, right? But the point being is we created this function, right? We started off with a brute force approach of drawing lines of circles across the screen. Using the conditional, we were able to do that with one block of code, right? Instead of having to call this function and update and hard code the updates that where we wanted it to be, we implemented a condition so that once the x-coordinate hit the end of our page, we reset it to 0 and added something to our y-coordinate, right? We had to abstract out these variables to make it into a function. And then we saw that once we start, right, trying to have a long list of variables that work with a name like this, or sorry, with a function like this, it begins to get tedious even with 2, right? So here is where objects become extremely powerful, right? And then there's even another layer that we'll look at where we have objects in arrays, right? Because what if we want 100 of these, right? All of a sudden, 100 objects like this become tedious, but we'll get there, right? So what I will sort of leave here as a question, how can we simplify this by passing an object to an object as an argument to our function, right? And we'll get to that, but I'll just leave that for the moment because really we'd want to clean this type of thing up where we have a lot of, it's easy to make a mistake here, right? It does help that Visual Studio Code tells us what we've made our arguments, right? Our parameters. But we can see that this would be difficult to remember, and so the question is left, what happens when we pass an object as an argument? How would this clean that up, right? So I'll leave that there, and we'll get back at it next module.